somebody said, do you remember on Thursday the Musketeers? Did you go home from school and watch Mickey Mouse and the Musketeers? Yes. And Thursday was my favorite day. This is Thursday, you know. And they said, today is Thursday. You know what that means? We're gonna have a special guest. If you remember this, just check. So get out the broom and sweep the place clean. Put out the mat so the welcome can be seen. Roll out the carpet, strike up the band, and give out with the hip hooray. Do you remember that talk, Bobby? Hip hooray. Yeah. And I want you to know that from my personal point of view, in 2011, he and his bride arrived in Boone, and it has never been the same. Absolutely never been the same. He is responsible for so much of that's happened in the last 11 years. He's been up in here over a decade. Jeez Louise. So anyway, the whole survey of downtown that was done, so us that we can have a historic district. Eric did grants. Anybody else would have charged $1 million for what he did. And the collections that we have from Palmer Blair, one of his little processes, it's just wonderful. If you haven't gone to Digital Watauga, you have really missed it. Please go to Ellen and Cy and who else is here that works on that project. Anyway, it is just wonderful, and it's all because of Eric. He's taught us how to do it. We probably wanted to do these things, but you know, I can remember projects that we work on, and I know Phoebe's worked on 400 of them. You say, okay, we've got the ideas, and we've got people who want to do it, and we could probably find the money, but how do we do it? Well, Eric knew how to do it, and that's been key to the success not only of the Historical Society, its rejuvenation, but also Digital Watauga, to the whole historic district. What else can we say? To this wonderful book that he's created for the 150th birthday party, which is going on all year. And I'm sure you've all seen so many of the publications about it. So please, be nice to Eric. He is just wonderful. Go, oh, Eric, you're just so wonderful. So, keep it right here. Make him feel good. Today is guest star day.
Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. And I'm going to stand over here, if that's okay, so I can drive the laptop. That's the easiest way to do this. That was a very generous and kind introduction. And it's somewhat inaccurate because the Digital Watauga project emerged from conversations really that Betty and I had when I first moved here. Those of you who know me know that I can be a little prickly as a person, and I'm not the best people person. Generally, Betty is a friend to everybody, and we would not have had the success without Betty reaching out to people and saying, hey, there's this great thing happening, you can help. Whether that be from encouraging people to donate things to the project, or to just getting the word out, encouraging people to make donations of money to the project. It's really pretty amazing what we do on the budget that we have. The entire budget, not just for Digital Watauga, but for the entire Historical Society, including paying the 3 technicians who all work part-time. All together, we have 32 hours, I think it is now, that go into the project, paid hours by our technicians. Our entire budget for the year is just over $25,000. So that doesn't mean that we're paying them terribly. I think they each say, actually, for the time that they have, the pay is pretty good. We made a commitment, for example, last year to move to paying all of our people starting at $15 an hour. And those who've been with the project longer make more than that. So all that is to say that we really are doing a lot without a lot. And that's, in a way, how this project for the book got started is, literally I had this lightning bolt moment of, wait a minute, this is the 150th year coming up of the incorporation of Boone as a town. And I don't know if anybody is talking about this. This is of a big deal. And I know the word sesquicentennial is a really hard word to say, but we figured out that Boone 150 was actually a better way to say that eventually. But I went first to the Historical Society folks, and I said, this is where we are, this is what's coming up, and I think this is a great opportunity to revisit the Arcadia books that have been done previously on Boone and Watauga County, and kind of do something that is special for this particular year. So that was the genesis of that, and then the Historical Society also encouraged people from the town and various other groups to get involved in sort of a coalition of people working together on Boone 150 events. But this project flowed from that idea. And if you've never written a book before, it's not as simple as saying, I want to do a book, and I'm going to do it so that it comes out in December. I'm going to work on it until November 30th, and we'll just be ready to roll right into it so it's out in December. No, not how it works. So I contacted Arcadia in March of 2021 and said, we would like to do this. Are you interested? And they said, yes, we're definitely interested. We need everything from you no later than June 30th. That means all of the images selected, all of the text written, all of the layout done, and they give you a layout planner to help you through that process. All of the rights cleared on the various images for things that we needed to do that with. Fortunately, every image, with a handful of exceptions of images that were taken by people in the project, every other image is actually from the project, so we've already cleared rights, so that made that a lot easier to do. And so, sure enough, we put that all together very, very quickly.
That's the royal we, by
the royal we.
Yeah, that's the royal
we pulled everything together and had this ready to go to them right at the beginning of July. And they said, well, we never thought that you'd do that quickly, so I know that you were aiming for a December of 2021 publication date. We can actually have this out in October, because this doesn't ever happen. All the people who do our books, they say, sure, I can meet that deadline. We have to correct things or whatever, but the copy's really clean, we're ready to go. So one of my conditions for doing this book is I did not want to be paid anything. I wanted all of the proceeds, all the author proceeds, all of the royalties, all of the direct sale proceeds by us to go directly to Digital Watauga. And fortunately, the Historical Society didn't fight me too much on that, and said, okay, we can do that. I'll mention to you that when you do book projects like this, there's some people in our community who have done Arcadia books before. I saw Terry Harmon earlier today. He's recently did Revisiting Watauga County. It's another great title in the Arcadia line. We're always kind of disappointed when you're doing this the first time, because the way to make money on these things is not on the author royalties. When you have an Arcadia book that sells in a bookstore, the author or whoever is the designated recipient of the funds gets 8% of that sale. They do offer you the opportunity to buy the books essentially at cost, so at about 50% of the face value of the book, and then you can individually sell them. So we saw this as an opportunity to buy a few boxes of them and sell them ourselves. And for that, we get the full amount of the face value less what we paid for this book. So it's much more attractive to us in terms of generating revenue for Digital Watauga. So that's kind of how we got there. I'll just mention as I go through these slides, some of the things you're looking at. This is Boone in 1885, taken from the hill just above where the Rivers house is now on Rivers Street. And probably not a single one of these buildings looks familiar to you, and that's because none of them are standing anymore, they're all gone. That is the first Boone Baptist Church, directly in the center of the photo, located on the south side of River Street. Beyond that is the Critcher Barn. And then above the Critcher Barn is the Critcher Hotel, formerly known as the Coffee Hotel. And the long building to the right of that is what was known as the Old Brick Row. This was a stable and tack and harness operation that when the hotel needed more rooms, they turned the stables into low-cost rooms here. So, and if you squint really hard, you might be able to see in the distance the old WB Council House, originally the Jordan Council Junior House, on the north side of Queen. It's this building right up here. And hidden somewhere in the trees there is the original council's store. So that gives you a sense of kind of what you're looking at here. So, great, we've got a book contract. How are we going to put this book together? How are we going to decide what we're going to put into this? So the first step was figuring out a way of organizing the book. Now, I am not dumping in any way on people who have done Arcadia books when I tell you what I'm about to tell you. But the average, or the usual Arcadia method is to pick themes. Transportation in Bristol, Tennessee. Churches in Bristol, Tennessee. And so you get these chapters that are sort of grouped into types of buildings or types of people, that kind of thing. Well, believe it or not, no one has ever written a book-length history of Boone. It's never been done. I knew that we were not going to be able to do a good history in the sense of a really thorough, accurately sourced, because that's not what Arcadia does in their Images of America series. These books are lots of images, captions for the images, and typically a short chapter introduction for each section. So I decided to sort of do something that was a middle ground. I wanted to tell Boone's story for this 150th anniversary because it's never really been told. And then I had to figure out, how am I going to organize that story? And as a historian, I tend to like things to be chronological, so I did it chronologically. The second step beyond that was to think about themes that run through history. What is Boone's story? What are the things that it's always struggled with? What are the ways in which relationships among the people in Boone have worked? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those as I go through the additional slides, but that was my thinking. Second was to go through and select appropriate images from our collections that could go into these various chapters, again, divided up chronologically. And then third was determining general layout of exactly where each image goes, why it belongs in that chapter, etc. Now, one of the things that was really important to me, and I'm going to draw your attention to this image of 12-year-old Sherry Grimes in the 1954 Arthur Smith Talent Hunt, and that was held here in Boone. And young Sherry Grimes was competing against lots of other talented people from Boone, and she won. Anybody know who came in second place in this talent hunt competition? Doc Watson came in second to Sherry Grimes. Yeah. So, I think it's relatively easy to see that Sherry Grimes was a black resident of Boone. We have a really thriving black community here in Boone, and we always have in the journalistic community. And unfortunately, the way stories have been told is to sort of, about black communities, is usually to sort of do this horrible thing that you'd think historians would think more wisely about, but they segregate the story. As if black people's experience just happens over here all by themselves and they never have anything to do with white people. I didn't want to tell this story that way. I didn't want to have a chapter on black life in Boone. That just did not feel right to me. So these chapters actually include images and in the introductions, part of the story about how that black community was experiencing that period of time as we move through history. And you can imagine some of the themes that you might expect to see in something on Black Life in Boone over a 150-year period. You know, there was a period of sharecropping and tenant farming that happened early on. There was the post-Reconstruction reaction, where you see Jim Crow laws come into effect, and black freedom restricted in a lot of ways. Yes, here in Boone. In the 1920s, the Klan was incredibly active in Boone, to the point that in 1925, I believe it was, the former courthouse courtroom, which had become a Masonic hall for a while and then a meeting hall, the owners of the building changed the name of that hall to Ku Klux Klan Hall in 1925. Throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, segregation continued to be a thing. Yes, our businesses here in Boone were segregated, many of them. And so it was important to kind of tell those pieces of the story in addition to just telling a broader story about Boone as I went through. Now, I know you can't read this fine print, but basically when you fill out an application to do a book with Arcadia, you have to tell them how you're going to organize the book. And this is the actual set of pages, they covered that part from the proposal, of how we were going to organize it. And I chose 6 chapters. I'm going to go through each of these individually, so I'm not going to read this to you here. But the idea, again, was to convey Boone's history over 6 chunks of time in a 150-year period. And so I began with early Boone and the Lost Province. Now, the last time I did a talk on this book, somebody was deeply offended by my reference to the Lost Province name for Boone and said, you know, I'm really sick and tired of hearing that about my ancestors because it makes it sound like we're all just a bunch of dumb hicks up here that didn't know how to drive on a road. And this is not accurate, and I wish people would stop using that term. This is a term, actually, that Boone and Watauga County, Allegheny County, Ashe County, etc., appropriated themselves right after World War I to describe this area. And they were doing it to persuade the North Carolina legislature, which had for decades been horrible about actually funding roads up here, good roads. So they basically went to the legislature and said, we are here from the Lost Province because it's really hard to get a car or a truck or a bus up here. We can, but our roads are terrible compared to what you have down here in Raleigh. And we will continue calling ourselves the Lost Province until you properly fund us. Because right now, we have to go to Tennessee if we want anything. We can't do it easily here in North Carolina. And that program worked. You saw funding over the next 20 years, essentially, until the end of the Great Depression, help with improving roads, and then really it took off after World War II, where you began to see the 421 and 321, things that some of you probably remember that were really twisty, but they were paved. Right. And that was really the first time that that happened. So the other thing that you're seeing here in this image, you're looking down King Street to the east. The building on the far left is the J.D. Crack Council House, which stood where the post office is now. The building in the far, far distance is the Blair Hotel. The building a little bit closer to us is the W.L. Bryan residence, and he also had a hotel associated with that. And then on the far right is the original Watauga Democrat building that stood where the current, and yet no longer, Watauga Democrat building is on King Street. If you've been to Ransom, the restaurant, that's the current version of that building. And this is right after the 1902 freshet, also referred to sometimes as the cloudburst. And you'll notice that there are trees and fence pilings and a whole lot of mud in the street. Why would all of that be in the street in Boone? What do you think the hillside in 1902, the whole Howard's Knob hillside, clear cut? And so if they didn't like the tree they just cut down, they'd leave it. And meanwhile, there was nothing to hold all of that soil against the mountain. And so this was not the first flood in Boone, but the one that is earliest for which we have an image. There's another very serious flood that happens in 1916, and of course some of you have almost surely heard about the 1940 flood that ended train service to Boone. So this is a great example of that 1902 event. I don't want you to think that Palmer Blair, by the way, was alive in 1902. What happened for Palmer Blair is somebody came to him and said, could you make a transparency of this original image? Basically take a print, convert it to a negative on transparency film, and then make new prints from that. And so he had done that, and this survives because he had done that work. So that last period went up through 1918. What happened in 1918 that was particularly relevant to Boone? Yes, World War I ended.
Flu.
What's that?
Flu.
The flu, yep. So we had the flu epidemic of 1918 that certainly impacted this area pretty hard. There's something else that happens in 1918 that Boones had been asking for almost 20 years, and they finally got it.
Quincy Railroad.
The railroad came, right? So the Linville River Railway, it's also often referred to as Tweetsy, and that's actually an inaccuracy. Yes, the rail line that is known as Tweetsy, the East Tennessee and Western North Carolina Railroad eventually bought the Linville River Railway, but the part that went to Boone was always the Linville River Railway. Yes, the trains had ET and WNC on the side, but the railway itself was still the Linville River Railway line. So that line gets completed from Shell's Mills to Boone in 1918. The depot is completed in 1919. And why would I pick that as an important transitional moment for Boone? What happens when you have a train suddenly coming into your bad roads community? Supplies. So for the first time, we're getting correctly kilned brick. So if you ever saw the 1905 courthouse that stood where the current courthouse is, if you remember that, one of the reasons why that courthouse was torn down is it was settling way too rapidly, in part because the brick was really soft. It had been kilned here in Boone. The restaurant known as Proper, that's the old Watauga County Jail, and that building was also, the brick for it was kilned here in Boone. And if you go up and really carefully look at the brick, you can see just how soft that brick is. There's not a lot of clay here, and so kilning brick locally was something that was not always a good idea, but it's what they could do before 1918. Post 1918, we've got a train that can bring us good brick. It can bring us good finished lumber. It can bring us automated factory sawn wood, as opposed to us having to stand out in the field and do it ourselves, or do it on an older machine run by horses or something like that. We can get this stuff from other communities and bring it in here. And most importantly, at the end of this period, it means we can bring in really good steel, something that was impossible to get here before the train came. And Betty and I have done tours of the Appalachian Theater, which has these, you can't see them now, but these massive steel beams. We know exactly what day those steel beams arrived. We've seen the manifests from the rail line of those things being on there. We know they were brought by the train, and that couldn't have been possible without the train, because at that time, the curves in the roads, you never would have been able to make the curve with a 50-foot long piece of steel. Wouldn't have happened. So during this period, as a result of the train being here, Boone actually launched a campaign called Watch Boone Grow. And most of those buildings you see in downtown Boone, the Mass General Store buildings, the old Qualls block, which is where the creamery is, a lot of that is closed right now, but there's this awesome chocolate place that's coming, just so soon, it's not far away. The Watauga County Bank, Farmers Hardware,
The theater.
Yeah. All of those buildings were the result of this Watch Boone Grow campaign. And so you really see a lot of the old frame architecture of King Street start to go away, and instead brick buildings being built. These gentlemen here are in the process of working on the Frank A. Linney block, which is the block that contains, well, I don't know what's in there now, the jewelry store, Sheer Shakti, if that's still there. Those stores are in this block, and all of these gentlemen were taking a break for this photographer to capture them, and in the background there is the J.D. Crack Council House where the post office sits today. And that would have been about 1924-ish. So toward the end of the Depression, there's, obviously there's a boom going on through the 20s up until not 1929, but actually 1927. And then most building stops. And it's a thing we tend to think of depressions and recessions as happening like that. They don't. It's often the people who are going to be most adversely impacted by those economic events who start to be the canaries in the coal mine first. And so in Boone, you had lots of farmers. We were very much an agrarian-based economy still in the 1920s. And in 1927, farms start failing. People can't get loans. Our banks are struggling to stay afloat in 1927. But there's still some people who are very hopeful. H.W. Horton, for example, decides he's going to build the finest store on King Street. You know today is the Horton Hotel, but originally the H.W. Horton building. And he completes that building the first week of October, 1929. And by the end of November, he had lost that building in foreclosure. So that's how we were hit here. We had two banks, the People's Bank and the Watauga County Bank. They both closed. And for a period of 3 years, people living in Boone were told, your money's fine. You can't get your money, but it's fine. Well, the People's Bank customers never got their money back. The Watauga Bank people eventually, through a long process I'm not going to go into, got some of their money back eventually. But we're talking like 10 to 20 cents on the dollar, not all of those deposits. And so that kind of paused things happening in Boone until the late 1930s, when the boom starts to pick up again as we're coming out of the Depression. Lots of WPA work that happens in Boone. You see that in things like the post office. The building out on Hardin Street / Blowing Rock Road that looks like a log cabin, that was a weaving operation that WPA came in and put in. The Watauga County, then known as, or for a long time known as the library, it's now the Annex that's on North Depot Street, or North Water Street. Those were all WPA buildings. Lots of other things that happened here too as part of that program. So there's a lot of money floating around, and then the war happens. We get another pause. And then coming out of the war, our locals realize everything has changed. Everybody's got a car, first of all. We've got all these auto dealerships in downtown now. And that's great. But how do we get the people elsewhere with cars? Now that we have better roads and this thing called the Blue Ridge Parkway is being built, how do we get those people to come here to Boone? And so the period in the late 40s into the early 50s is all about tourism. And this is when this transition happens, where we become a tourist town. You see things like tourist courts start to pick up, be built. And if you don't know what a tourist court is, think of those little roadside Norman Bates-like motels, on the side of the road. That's the kind of thing that's built. There were almost a dozen of them here in Boone, built between 1946 and about 1957. Today there's only one left. That's the Blue Ridge Tourist Court, which is currently being renovated. It's over by the high school, just beyond the high school entrance. So those things are built to give people a place to stay. And the town also decides, we need an outdoor drama. This is the hottest ticket everywhere else, so we need one in this very rainy place that is only warm for 2 to 3 months a year. We need to have one, and sure enough, that's how we get Horn in the West. But Horn in the West comes out of this parade, which is the 1949 Centennial Parade. You're standing in this image on the marquee of the Appalachian Theater. You're looking out at King Street here. In the way distance up at the top, you can see the porch of the Jones House. And the people standing there on the upper right side are standing on the lawn of the Daniel Boone Hotel, which was a Watch Boone Grow building that was built in 1925. Beautiful hotel. It's a shame we don't have it anymore. But this parade was, come to our centennial. And for this parade, they organized a series of vignettes about mountain history. And it's from that the idea for some sort of outdoor drama emerged. And then they went and got Kermit Hunter to write an outdoor drama. He'd done the one at Cherokee and one that's at Roanoke, North Carolina. And he was very popular in 1949. And they were able to snag him, and he wrote Horn in the West for us. This collection, by the way, the E.T. Glenn collection, just went online this week. And so if you go to digitalwatauga.org, it'll be the first collection at the top. It is beautiful. It's not in color here, but all of these are slide images, and they are Kodachrome, and they are just delicious to look at. So that's what you got going on here. Now, one of the things that marks this period is you have people from the county, people from the town, and people from what was then the college working together. How do we make this so that we all win? And that's why we get those things, is they all worked together to accomplish that. This begins to change in 1960, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. But in the middle of the book, I inserted a chapter that is just workers of Boone of the 1950s. And I think this is my favorite part of the book. Palmer Blair decided in 1952, you know what, we always take pictures of the politicians and the important businessmen and women. We don't ever take pictures of the people who actually do stuff around here, who actually do the jobs. And so, I take lots of pictures out on the street as part of my job, but I'm gonna go into these businesses and take pictures of people just doing their jobs. About 400 of these images survive in his Workers of Boone series. You're seeing a gentleman here, I'm gonna blank on his first name, but his last name was Lyons, Lyons. And he ran a produce stand in an old bus shell that was located where the Jimmy John's is now on that corner. And he would sit in that bus shell all day and sell his produce. And he was a fixture of that location for about a decade. And in 1959, he moved uptown to the old Pastime Theater and kind of sold out of the front of that for about a year and then retired in old age. So that chapter, obviously I couldn't put all 400 of the images in there, but there are about 40 images in there, about 10% of that collection. We then moved to becoming a university town. So the university actually happens in 1967, that's the transition point. Joins the UNC system in 1973. But that transition is when you begin to see a change in the relationship among county, town, and school. And part of that is because as the town is expanding, and the college/university is expanding, they're starting to run up against one another and competing for space. Meanwhile, there are all kinds of political issues that are shifting. Boone is becoming a much more liberal location than it had been previously, while the county was remaining fairly conservative. And so you get political tensions occurring. In addition, you get questions about taxation, questions about alcohol use, questions about how to utilize the land and defend against things like that crazy project that we built in the middle of the floodplain, why did we do that? Because that was a really bad idea. Or that thing that we just put on top of the mountain, did we really want to do that? And people politically arguing over those questions, and people in Boone beginning to be concerned. Traffic becomes a major concern in this window of time. And so what you see here is a protest in, I think, 1972, happening on what we now know as River Street, when it was just a dusty back street of Boone. And the students here are protesting the fact that the university is cutting all kinds of trees. Oh, and by the way, they want to create a road that runs from Blowing Rock Road all the way to what was then South Water Street, and have it be a thoroughfare, sometimes described as the Boone bypass or something like that. It was a way of getting around downtown, and there was immediate reaction from the students. Are you crazy? You know, this thing is through the middle of campus. We have to cross the street. This is just not a good idea. And you're not thinking smartly about the environment by doing this. We then get into the character of Boone, which is really the question of, okay, now we have these tensions. What are we going to be as a town? What do we want our future to be? And again, that same conflict is ongoing. We hear a lot today about how the town and the county can't get along, or the school and the town can't get along, those kinds of things. Those issues have been going on for 60 years. They're not new. And yet, when you look at our history, we're repeating many of the same things. There's that old George Santayana line about those who can't remember the past are doomed to repeat it, and there's a good bit of truth in that, right here in Boone. We're still fighting the same battles. And so, I ended with, this is actually the last image in the book. This is Roberta Jackson standing with Junaluska Community Marker that was dedicated last June. And a lot of this chapter really focuses on this tension between development and preservation, because I think that really has been one of Boone's major stories from the early 1980s, where the Daniel Boone Hotel was torn down, to the present, and it continues to be a big story. So how do you buy the book? Well, I have some here tonight, and that's one way to get them. You can also go to our website, WataugaCountyHistoricalSociety.org/shop, and they're available there. This is Mrs. Dacus. She is standing in the Dacus Radio Shop, at that time located in the old Boone Woodworking building on Howard Street. And I just love this image because there is so much character in her face, and she strikes me as someone I would have liked to have known if I'd been here in Boone in 1952. So, also from that Workers of Boone series.
Because all 400 of those are in the digital.
Yeah, those are all online and visible now. So, I believe that's it. So I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Can we clap now?
You can. Monica.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah. And do you want to just say a word about the panels? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so a big thank you to Cy, and I don't know who helped you with this, if anybody, but I assume that you are responsible for putting these up today?
Yeah, it was kind of just slapping them up there really quickly.
So in March, if you were able to get to the Jones House for the exhibition they always have each month in the main room there, in the main gallery, we did an exhibition called Workers of Boone. And we used a lot of the images from Palmer Blair's series, but also some other images that preceded that series and from since that time. So that exhibition is no longer up, but we wanted to remind you that that's an important story. There was a section in this exhibit on the effect that the pandemic has had, and of course the Great Resignation that we've all heard a good bit about since the pandemic started, of people just deciding, I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm tired of being abused as a worker, and I don't want to work for that kind of pay or under those kinds of circumstances or conditions anymore. So we talked a good bit about that in the exhibit, and these are just some of the images from that. All of these images, with a couple of exceptions, are available online also to see. And I'll just remind you, Digital Watauga is a free project. You don't have to register to visit things and see things on our website. You don't have to pay, you don't have to subscribe. It's all there for you to see for free. That's our mission. The only time we ever charge anybody anything is if they say, I would like to do a book and use this particular image because I'm going to be making money off of that image. And we do that because many of the collections in our project, we don't own the rights to them. We've negotiated what's called a digital use rights deed of gift with the donors. There are a couple of people here from the Blair Spencer family, for example, Palmer Blair's folks, who we've been working with now for 6 years, I think. I think that's right. And what happens is, first of all, I had to convince Sarah Lynn Spencer to even participate. I think it took me 3 years of, Sarah Lynn, this would be a really great idea. And I think I was being tested for 3 years to make sure I was trustworthy, to be honest, because I was new. But she eventually said, yeah, I really want to do this. And that was one of our earliest collections. And we're not only helping the family rehouse I think we're over 20,000 negatives easily at this point from his collection. We're helping them rehouse that so that the original items will survive. And in addition, when we get those requests, and we've had a lot of them for that particular collection, we work for them in negotiating a fee for those items, and then they take a large chunk of whatever is paid for the use of the commercial use of those images. This kind of goes back to what Betty often says when she's talking about the project: we don't want your stuff, which sounds weird, but she's right. We don't typically want to hold onto your stuff permanently. And I'd say probably a little over half of our collections are digital use rights agreements, meaning we've digitized the things and we've given them back to you, because that's not the nature of our project. We don't have, the Smithsonian Archives to hide everything in, like that scene from the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark where it's giant warehouse and just stuff. We don't have that. We have 3 cabinets out in the main part of the library here, and that's it. So occasionally, though, we get people who say, if you don't take it, I'm throwing it away. And that's why a little over 40% of our collections are owned outright by us.
But but about saying that we don't want this stuff, because they actually have ideas of what they want to do with that stuff. And we have one man who has given his collection to be digitized, and because he wants the real stuff to go to the Southern collection in Chapel Hill. And that's great. So we have digitized it. It'll be on our website, but the stuff will be at the archives at Chapel Hill. And that, I don't think he realized that when we first talked to him about doing this. He thought once we somehow digitize it, we're going to suck it up into something.
Right.
Gone. But that's a very attractive for a lot of people with a lot of good stuff.
Yeah.
That they really don't. They want to save, but they don't want to quite do it.
Now, I'll throw one thing out to you. If you have stuff at home, we want to hear from you.
Yeah, right.
If you have, and it doesn't have to be all that old. Betty, and sometimes, I love Betty so much. She's one of my dearest friends in Boone, but she sometimes drives me crazy when she'll call me. She'll say, I have another box. Not even stuff of hers. It's like somebody has dropped a box off at her house, and then I have to figure out where we're going to put this. But we really do want your stuff. We want to hear from you. And some of those things that Betty brings to me are from 10 years ago, not 50 years ago. Because this is something we also realized early on in the project. It's great to have all this stuff from a long time ago, but if you're not also preserving the things from 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, they'll be lost. And I didn't say it earlier, that the impetus for this project was the closure of the Appalachian Cultural Museum by ASU. That's how we got started. I came here in 2011 looking for the museum, looking for the Historical Society, which had never had a physical home, And then I got in touch with Betty and I said, what is going on in this town? You know, where are these things? And she told me the story about the closure of the museum. And that story is actually a really sad story, where people had given things outright or had put them on loan with the Cultural Museum. And when the museum closed over a 5-year period, a lot of it was deaccessioned. And in many cases, you know, people who had loaned grandma's dress were never called. And then they'd call, where's grandma's dress? We don't know, it's gone. And so when I got here, part of what I was seeing was this diminution of trust in the community. And so our project was intentionally, we don't want your stuff. We just want to borrow it for a few minutes and give it back to you. Well, it's always more than a few minutes, but we want to borrow it from you and get it back to you as quickly as we can, because we know that the stuff is important to you and we want to build trust with you. And so we've been able to do that over time. And you know, we've talked a lot about in our processes, our procedures, you can't screw up.
Yeah.
Because if you mess up, you lose that trust. And so we are incredibly careful. Cy and Ellie will both tell you that, like, we have rules about what you can and can't do and how you have to handle things and what you can have in the room with the things and all kinds of stuff. So we really are a professionalized operation. We're not just a bunch of people who think history is cool. It's not just that. Other questions?
Just another note about the exhibit real quickly. If anyone would like to see it in its entirety, senior technician Jennifer Woods has digitized it and uploaded it online. So you can go to digitalwatauga.org and look under exhibit to see the whole thing and not just these little snapshots.
Thank you, Cy.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
So the earliest pictures in the book are from a man from Morganton called L.A. Ramseur.
Yes.
What's his story? What was he doing taking pictures here in 1885?
So he did have a studio there. This seems to have been a relatively short-lived studio because he then went out west shortly after 1885. It appears that the studio was open from maybe 1880, 1881 to about 1885. Probably somebody commissioned him and said it could have been the town. I don't know. We know nothing about these except that they're stereo cards. Does anybody know what a stereo card is? Just quickly for those who don't, it was a way of getting a 3D image to the viewer. So you'd have two images that were shot with a stereoscopic camera. They were slightly offset. The lenses are about as wide apart as your eyes. And so it would, when viewed through a viewer, the card at the end, and look through the viewer, it would create the illusion of Boone in 3D because the parallax was essentially achieving that for you. We don't know why those were commissioned. We have no idea. But they came to us from a family collection, from the, I believe it was the Nell Coffey collection. She had them for whatever reason, and they are stamped with Ramseur. Some of them are stamped with Ramseur stamp on the back. That's all we really know. They were part of the historic Boone collection. The historic Boone collection long predated Digital Watauga. We were talking earlier about competing interests as part of our history. For a while, there was the Watauga County Historical Society, and then Historic Boone was we want to do our own history. We don't want those university people telling our story. That's, in essence, what was going on there. And so there was friction between those two groups. Historic Boone was actually really good about going out and acquiring things. A lot of the things in the collection came from estate sales, where they'd show up and say, we want to buy that, that, and that. We want to bid on that auction item, etc. Whereas the Historical Society, as you might expect from a more academic-oriented project, was more about telling the stories than getting the stuff. So that's a long roundabout way of saying that's about all we know about them. But they're beautiful. I love those images. There are four of them in our collection. Yes?
Along with this project, which is wonderful and very important, how about the oral history, the old timers? Are you engaging in interviewing people, or is that sort of not where you're going with this project?
So-
They're the ones that give you the temper, and the stories are fascinating, and I don't know where you're at with that, as far as incorporating the project.
So that actually is on our plan.
Yeah.
And so I'll give you a little bit of background. At the same time that we were trying to figure out how to do this, Betty and I and many other people were on the board, but Betty still is, on the board of the Appalachian Theater. One of the first things we did in 2012 was we need an oral history project so that we can understand this theater better than we understand it right now. We interviewed, I think, a total of 60 people, I believe, for that, somewhere close to 60 people. And, you know, I did many of those interviews myself. And we have poor Claudia Moeller is on her last 3 she's doing the transcription of the interviews, and she's on her last 3, and then we'll be done. And my hope is that the board will decide to add those to the existing Appalachian Theater collection so that you'll get those 60 voices. It's not just about the theater, it's people talking about their lives here in Boone, why they went to the theater, things they remember about downtown. They're wonderful interviews. And so in a way that work has been done, it's just not publicly available yet.
And most of the oral history stuff too is being done by Appalachian Studies at the university.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We also have some oral histories that were we think in the historic Boone collection. They were just in a cabinet, and we think they were intended to be part of that. Our intention sometime beginning this year is to begin transcribing those, and I asked the team who wants to do that, and Ellie went, me, please let me do that, please, I really want to do that. And then we talked more about that, and we would like to actually begin an oral history program. Ellie and Cy did really the first of those interviews actually with Roberta Jackson. When we were, you may not know that Roberta was named in March, I believe, to the Watauga County Historical Society Hall of Fame. We're announcing somebody each month this year. Our recipients so far are the illustrious Betty Bond, Rhonda Horton, who was a Black minister in the Junaluska community. Roberta, last month was John and Faye Cooper. And we have a secret individual for May. This is a lady who did a whole lot to make Horn in the West happen, to preserve our history. And there's a big announcement coming, but I'm not going to say who it is, even though half the room knows who it is. So she's our next. And we have our other people selected for the rest of the year already. So, other questions? Well, thank you so much for coming out to hear about the book. Please tell your friends. If you absolutely, if you're in a situation where you absolutely need a copy right now and you don't want to wait for it to be shipped to you from our website,
Please.
You can go to Mass General Store, which carries it. I believe that Foggy Pine may have a few copies. I'm not aware of anybody else in town that's carrying it.
Do you want us to buy it tonight?
If you want one, I would prefer you buy it tonight just because, as I said earlier, more money goes to digital Watauga.